Well, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you today. Today is July 6th, 2023, and our special speaker today is Christina Maldonado. I know that so many of you are so familiar with Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. Started, well, I guess about 3 years ago now, in the spring of 2020. Founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin as a way to give back during the pandemic, seeing how many people were food insecure, joined by Jeff Kitchaven, my co-moderator, and then myself, and all of you wonderful people who are here live so many weeks of the year, or listen and watch this on Zoom at a later time, or on YouTube, or wherever you get your videos. So thank you so much for your generosity in donating to food banks. Jeff, it's your favorite part of the presentation. What's the number today before we get going?
Thank you, Jean. And yes, indeed, it is one of my favorite parts of the program each morning when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed to food banks worldwide in honor of our great speakers. It's an amazing number we get to announce this week, Jean. $413,727.57. Thank you so much to our great speakers for these wonderful presentations, and to our wonderful audiences for their generous contributions. Jean, back to you.
Well, it just keeps getting better every week, doesn't it? It's just so amazing. As you know, there's no charge for these programs, everyone. We just ask that you make a donation to either the food bank that the speaker suggests, or your favorite local food bank, or wherever it might be in the world. And through these donations, more than 4 million meals have been served around the world. So thank you so much. And then if you would please let Jeff or let me know, or Natalie know the amounts that you've donated, we would be thrilled to add it to our running total. That's the only way that we are able to keep a running total. So thank you. That said, let's get to today's speaker, Cristina Maldonado. She is a full-time mediator and arbitrator. She is a member of the National Academy of Distinguished Neutrals based in Florida. She has served as Florida Supreme Court certified mediator in civil cases, dependency and family cases since 2010. She's mediated over 2,000 cases. She's chair-elect of the Florida State Bar's ADR section, and she is the founding chair of the section's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. She is approved by the Florida Dispute Resolution Center as a primary trainer in the areas of circuit, civil, and family mediation. Christina has a bachelor's from Amherst College, and her doctorate, or JD, is from St. Thomas University. Her master's degree in between those two is a master's in conflict resolution from George Mason University. She is fluent in both Spanish and Portuguese, which makes her a perfect candidate then to be talking about today's program, which is Multilingual Mediation, the ethics of mediating with multiple languages. And besides her mediation career and viewpoint on this, Christina had a prior career basically working on international development program work for the United States government, and using government project funds in Central America to do wonderful things, and to put them to good use for the people there. So anyway, we're thrilled to have you with us, Christina. Perhaps you can say something about your food bank that you're proposing and suggesting to the group, and then get going with your presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here. It's been such an amazing series. I've watched several of the presentations, and I'm excited to be with you as a presenter. I'm, as far as the food bank that I'm putting up for a worthy cause. It's their website is literally thesoupkitchen.org. They've been a food bank in Boynton Beach, Florida for 40 years. And are very worthy. They'll put your assistance to good use. I do have a slide at the end where you can donate a box of diapers too, but I don't think Will Work for Diapers is quite as catchy a title for the series. So I understand you're sticking with Will Work for Food, but if people want to, you know, switch it up a little, you never know. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Give me 2 seconds, because this is a topic that is just dear to my heart for obvious reasons, I guess. The other factors that I grew up overseas too. I was sort of born in Venezuela, Cuban dad, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and Chile. That's where I got the Portuguese. The Spanish came baked in, so I take no credit in learning language as an adult. They were all in there before I was 15, and so, but they've led me to several opportunities as far as practice work is concerned. There's also some, you know, 8th grade French in there probably somewhere too. But I have mediated as well with people whose languages I don't speak, right? And I think that that's the case for most mediators, even if you're not personally multilingual yourself. You always are going to be in a scenario at some point that will run into multilingual parties or even lawyers, right? So that I can think of, languages that I've seen in mediation are Tagalog, German, Russian, Korean, Japanese, Mandarin, Chinese, Vietnamese, Hebrew, and Mam and Kaqchikel, which are languages from Guatemala. And that's just sort of my list that I can think of that I've had. And so just when you, there we go. I think when you look at the numbers, and this is an international call, so probably appreciate it more than most, right? It's not a surprise that we run into language access issues all the time. There's 197 countries in the world, and there are 7,000 languages in the world, for those of you trivia buffs. And for those of you who are in the US, you may or may not know that the US is the 2nd largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, if you look at total speakers, and the 4th largest if you look only at native speakers. We have 51.6 million total Spanish speakers, and of which 41 million are native and 11.6 are bilingual. So we're there after Mexico, Colombia, and Spain and Argentina are about the same size. So in my home state, the 3rd most common language is French Creole, because we have a very large Haitian population here. And so on a national level, when the census asked people in 2020, how, you know, do you speak any other language other than English at home? About 22% of people came back and said yes. And in the US, that's 1 in 5. And so I know that's not as much compared to perhaps Europe, where people are, you know, don't try and multilingual. But for the US, where it's so English only, some of this part here is kind of invisible to us, right? So, and in this something else category that's in the US, you have another 430 languages. And some of those are native languages, some are international, and some are like sign language, right? Signed. So this brings me to the main question that I really want to talk about today. And it doesn't matter whether you are monolingual or multilingual. How can we as mediators understand language access issues and approach them in a better way? And so the presentation is designed in 3 pieces. And so I want to talk first about some important concepts about fluency and proficiency and language gaps, and some of the issues that they present for mediation participants. Then I want to talk about interpretation and translation. And then I want to apply mediator ethical standards to some scenarios that are not uncommon. So when someone says that they're fluent in a language, what do they really mean? To be able to be fluent in a language is not just to be able to speak that language. It's got 4 components. So to be fluent, you have to have the ability to read, the ability to write, to understand, and to speak. And the first 2 are literacy skills, right? Reading and writing, reading texts, writing them. Speaking and understanding are verbal skills, and the ability to follow and get the meaning of what's being said, or to produce speech in a language that's being understood, right? So to be bilingual, the ability to use those 2 both languages or more languages with equal fluency. So technically you should be able to do all four things well, right? But the reality is that not everyone who is bilingual in the speaking and understanding sense is equally biliterate in that reading and writing sense. So considering the components of fluency, it might be a question of degree, right? How proficient is a person with the different aspects of a language? That basic knowledge is that like 101, or, I can get through at a restaurant and find my way to the bus stop kind of basics. Conversant means you can handle uncomplicated social situations, how's your family, stuff like that. Proficient is an advanced skill level, right? Someone who is very skilled but uses it less easily than a native speaker or a fluent speaker. And at a fluent level, you don't have to stop and think about it, right? You're going back and forth. You can read, speak, write, and understand. Maybe you were born with it, native speaker. Maybe you learned it later. But sometimes a person can be more proficient at speaking and less proficient at writing. And I think that's the classic scenario of someone who learned a language at home, but studied and worked in another language, like your immigrant parents kind of situation, and the child who went all the way through school and is now working in another language, right? Or also a person can be very proficient at reading, but they're less proficient at understanding on the fly or speaking. And that is the classic scenario of someone who has a lot of book learning, but not as much lived experience. Now, imagine the frustration that is experienced by someone who can't understand what you're saying. Or that person might feel lost. They might feel angry. They might feel stupid. They might feel uncomfortable, or they might feel at a disadvantage or very distrustful of what's going on. A person has to ask for help, and nobody really likes to ask for help. But getting what they need it requires a lot of courage and effort. And sometimes it really does need that assistance. So I think it's important to keep those feelings and factors in mind as we talk about the next concept, which is the idea of a language gap. So a language gap is a mismatch in some aspect of language between two people. If you want to consider a language gap related to fluency, you can look at the sort of speaking and understanding ones. I can't say what I want to say in a way that you understand me, or what are you telling me I don't understand, right? Or you might have one having to do with reading and writing, which is I don't understand what I'm reading, or I would like to write what you want me to write in a professional, grammatically correct kind of spelling level, but I'm not quite there, right? And so again, you have sort of questions of degree. That language gap can be narrower if both sides share some basic or conversant knowledge, but there still might be a real challenge that's too hard to bridge. On the one hand, that gap can be bridged if you find someone who knows your language, though, even just a little bit, in a place that you didn't expect to find them. And that's a relief. It's just not going to be as hard, right? You can think of that lost tourist picture, and the level of discomfort goes down. But if you don't have enough commonality to be able to bridge it, then it's going to become a barrier. Now, I want to apply this to mediation next. Let's focus on language in these examples, and imagine that everyone in this image feels they speak the same language. Let's say they all speak English, right? Or we can also say that everyone in this image speaks the same languages. And I'm going to use Spanish consistently through as my sort of additional language example, but it could be anyone, right? So all three, the mediator, the party, and the lawyer, speak, understand, read, and write English and Spanish with enough proficiency that communication can flow smoothly. And now there's no language gap. So what happens if your party lacks a common language? Let's start with the party's perspective. That gap might be manageable, again, if it's a question of proficiency. The situation where someone understands a language maybe, but doesn't speak it fluidly. Some people are very shy about making mistakes, but they understand most of what they hear. Some people just need some extra time to mentally process from one language to another so they can fully understand or think of what they want to say. Or they might need just occasional clarification. But to proceed in a situation where it's a big gap, the mediator is risking that the party is not going to fully understand what the mediator wants is communicating to them and can't communicate back. And either one of you might miss something important. You can really see that immediate sense of exclusion. So what are some questions that a person who doesn't speak a common language might be asking themselves when faced with the prospect of attending mediation? Here are some examples, right? Is my English good enough to fully engage? Can I speak, read, and write enough to do this without help? And understand, can I communicate with my lawyer? Can I communicate with my mediator, with the other side, with their lawyer? Can I make my wishes understood to all these people and understand them? Can my lawyer communicate with me and advise me? And will my language issues get in the way of completing mediation today? What kind of help do I need to participate fully? Is the help available? How much does it cost? Can I afford it? Because it's likely that that person's going to have to pay for it. And more generally, am I being respected or discounted because of my lack of fluency? So if you have an English-speaking party in an English-speaking system who's experiencing language gaps in mediation, and they run into that respect issue and everybody else speaks another language, right? I think even, in an all English mediation, even native English speakers can find themselves at a loss when they run into legal jargon and you're starting to hear acronyms and insurance terms or legal terms or things that throw you off, that are sort of outside the regular speech that you use on a daily basis. But they do have that one advantage, though, that the court system is in English and that agreement's going to be written in English, and that accrues to their favor. But a person who doesn't speak English at all or has a limited English proficiency is at a more immediate disadvantage because they are now burdened with resolving the issues relating to the need, availability, and cost of these accommodations that are necessary for them to participate on approximately equal footing. So what if the lawyer lacks a common language? You might see a small gap where a lawyer understands but doesn't speak their client's language, but you can end up with a sort of one-way communication challenge. The lawyer may have hired that multilingual mediator to help clarify what they're saying for the client with a few phrases here or there, but you can start to see that there's an ethical risk for a multilingual mediator here. This is unlikely to happen to an English-speaking mediator if the mediation is going to be in English, but if you're dealing with another language in an English-speaking court system, it does happen. You have the situation where I have had situations where the lawyer neither understands nor speaks their client's language. They just both show up. And in the office, they've been communicating through one of the staff members. There's usually a multilingual paralegal who's their go-between, but that person may or may not be there. And that the party may or may not have brought an extra person to help them out. And it might be a family member, or it might be a trusted friend, or, the best case scenario, it's a certified interpreter. But once you start getting into the sort of informal ad hoc interpreters, things are starting to shake, and you're going to have to do some adjusting. But without any kind of interpreter, this is a risky situation for multilingual mediators because maybe that lawyer chose the mediator because they feel that this person is going to make their client more comfortable, and they trust that that mediator is going to be more effective at settling the case because of that combination of language, cultural, mediation abilities. And maybe they just don't want to pay for the interpreter. Like, this client doesn't have the resources. This all needs to be done quickly and efficiently. Please help close this case out for me. I'd like to be out of it, please, right? Or any combination of the above. So based on the discussion, here's a sort of a series of questions that a lawyer can ask, and a lot of them are similar, right? In terms of what they're considering. But how do the language gaps stack up on one side compared to the other? And does that situation benefit or harm my client? I think the affordability questions are always sort of practically upfront for people as well. Now, what if it's the mediator? I think this is the scenario that we've all been in, where the mediator lacks the common language. It can happen whether you're monolingual or multilingual. It's going to happen to all of us eventually. And so in this case, what often happens is that lawyer is going to take the lead in the negotiations with the mediator on behalf of their client who's going to hang back. And the attorney is going to take over the interpreter and translator roles potentially and explain to the client what the mediator is saying, read any agreement to them if it's like really extreme, no English kind of situation. And there is a barrier between the mediator and the party. So this can really affect self-determination if you decide to go forward. If the party has something to say that the attorney is not relaying, the mediator is going to miss that, or vice versa. And so if everybody sort of switches into a sidebar in the other language, you're going to be lost at sea. Now, if there is no lawyer at all in this scenario, and the mediator neither understands nor speaks the party's language, then they really need an interpreter. I don't think you can go forward without one in that kind of situation. And then again, the question of degrees, right? Does the interpreter do a good job or a middling job or a bad job? They might not clearly communicate the party's wishes to the mediator. They might just be saying what you're saying to them and not necessarily communicating everything they're saying to you, right? And so it's sort of an inaccurate or incomplete, right, kind of interpretation. Sometimes you might have a scenario where they end up injecting their opinions in the process or get more involved. Or maybe everything goes really well and you happen to get a really good interpreter. Here's sort of a list of questions that as mediators we can ask either during the scheduling or at the start of mediation to determine whether language issues can be managed or resolved in this case or not, and we have to reschedule for another day. So I think of it in some ways as screening for domestic violence if you have a practice that involves that, right? Where you're sort of, you're trying to ensure the self-determination of a potential victim without, in this case, you're kind of screening for potential advantages and disadvantages, right? Or if you're screening for like disability access issues, for example, right? What is it that you need to do to level the playing field to ensure a good process here for everybody to be able to exercise their self-determination? The mediator has to be honest with their own abilities, verbal, bilingual, and the written biliterate ones, and any of the gaps and how they affect other people, right? I think sometimes our effectiveness flows from being able to bridge the gap with the community, being able to be that outsider who's not caught up in the dispute itself. And it's a blessing to be able to use sort of an extra layer of expertise to make things run smoothly and resolve the dispute in a way that everybody is feeling heard, right? But there are sometimes lines that we may not feel comfortable, or depending on the jurisdiction, we might not be able to cross. The challenge is, you know, if a mediator speaks all the languages on all the sides, there's no gap. But the dynamics usually get complicated because in mediation, you have at least 3 people, right? Party, mediator. And add a lawyer, now you have 4, add another lawyer, now you have 5, and so on from there, right? And so the odds are that you have at least one gap and that those gaps are going to interact with each other and create new issues. So the biggest challenge to perceptions of impartiality, from my perspective, is when one side has a language gap and the other side does not. The side with the gap is, in this picture, it's side B. They inevitably feel like the other side is going to have it easier from a communications perspective. In English, if the B side here is an English-speaking party, in a case where the mediator on the other side shares sort of a common additional language, that person's going to feel disadvantaged because there's a conversation going on that they feel they should understand when they don't completely understand. And that, again, US based, but or English speaking country based. A no English or a limited English party who can't communicate directly with their mediator is doubly disadvantaged. So not only does the court system not speak their language, but neither does the mediator. And now the challenge is to manage the perception that communication on one side and between one side and the mediator is going to be just as easy and fluid and accurate on both sides. I think that is our duty as professional neutrals. We are striving for impartiality, even as we struggle with all kinds of situations that have built-in imbalances, right? Secretly, I think everyone hopes that the mediator is on their side and they're going to cling to any kind of similar characteristics like shared language ability to build on the natural inclination to connect by convincing themselves that this person is like me, they get me, they like me, and they're going to help me and the other side, hopefully, right, through the process. Because the flip side is an erosion of trust if that kind of dynamic doesn't kick in. So that kind of covers the whole fluency, proficiency, and language gaps part of this. I want to switch gears into the translation and interpretation part of the presentation. So Ty Mordoni is in the waiting room. He's a fellow colleague down here and trainer. Hi, Ty. We're about to, I'm going to go here with the Merriam-Webster definition of translation and interpretation. And translation is an act, process, or instance or rendering from one language into another. So from one's own or another language. And interpretation is to explain or tell the meaning of in understandable terms. I put the typewriter under translation and the microphone under interpretation because I find that distinction useful. In the legal world, I think of the exact relaying of a written item as a translation. Like, I am going to go get a certified copy, a certified translation of this document, right? And the verbal communication is subject to interpretation, as in I'm going to hire an interpreter or have one provided by the court. And that distinction, to me, helps distinguish what practice has to be done. That doesn't mean that in real life you can't have a verbal translation or a written interpretation, but on the whole, reading and writing gaps are resolved by a translator, and speaking and understanding gaps can be resolved by an interpreter. So, when you're dealing with documents, you want to sort of shoot for something like the American Translation Association, something standardized. Anyone who, if you have a limited language person and they've been through immigration, they're probably familiar with having to pay a certain amount of money for getting a page translated per page for translation of a document. When a certified translation comes back, it comes back with a sworn affidavit saying this is accurate, right? And so in some cases, though, it's the people and not the courts that require that translation. So there's nothing that says that you can't go out and get that informal translation for it to be, for example, a living, working document for the people who are going to leave your mediation and maybe still need to rely on what was written up in that mediation. In terms of the question of whether a mediator can be the translator or a mediator can serve as the translator, that's a little more ambiguous depending on where you are. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that's a big question as far as translation is concerned. On the one hand, when you're dealing with contracts, you have sort of that duty to read where you can be illiterate or you don't speak English or your English is not technical. And any of these people who sign an English language agreement are going to have trouble defending themselves to some degree if they turn around and say, I can't read, or I can't read in English, or I didn't understand what I read, or I didn't read it at all. Right. If you signed it without getting the help that you needed, you may have to live with those consequences. But on the other hand, at least in the US, there are civil rights protections that come into play. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on national origin. And so English language requirements might cause a disparate impact based on national origin. So in employment, if you have English only rules that are sort of not a business necessity just because, it might be a violation of employment law. And in the US, any entity that receives federal money has got to take reasonable steps to make their programs or services or activities accessible to people with limited English proficiency. And so in the case of mediators, we have not got an affirmative duty to provide language assistance in national origin cases. And that's different potentially from a scenario that's covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, where we might actually have an affirmative duty to provide an accommodation. But a lawyer who's accepting a client with limited English has a professional duty to communicate effectively with that person and to serve them competently. And that is deemed to include getting an interpreter and or a translator at service, right? And this has been laid out plainly in a recent American Bar Association opinion, but it's been out there for a while. You can see that in other places. Sometimes the courts will step in and appoint an interpreter or require the appointment of one. And that's usually when there's something really fundamental at issue, at least down here in Florida. It's got to be that person has no clue what's going on. They're going to sit there like a potted plant and not be part of the proceedings that are involving them. Or there's a fundamental interest at stake, like we're taking away your parental rights. We're going to put you away for mental health issues, or put you in jail for a criminal offense, or take your children away, or determine your paternity, those kinds of things. But there's really no alternative. Like, you just can't get around proceeding in any kind of a fair way without having someone be the in-between communicator. But in practical terms, there is a very wide range as to the quality and availability of language access services that are provided by the court. Even in Florida, that has so many different languages and so many different language speakers, and some places, some state court circuits and some are better than others, right? I'll just leave it at that. But language access services are fundamental to supporting access, to supporting fairness, public trust, and confidence in the court system. So,
Christina, I have a question.
Sure.
My understanding is that the act of explaining to someone the significance of a contract in which they are about to enter is law practice. That's practice of law.
yes,
So
I mean, depending on where you are, that can be seen as giving legal advice.
Well, explaining this is what the contract means. These are the rights. These are your obligations. In California, I believe there'd be no problem putting that within the ambit of law practice. So if someone other than a lawyer is explaining to someone the significance of a contract into which they are about to enter, could that be the unauthorized practice of law? And how do we make sure that, or what would be the responsibility of a mediator to make sure that the advice that a client is getting is from their lawyer, a lawyer?
And that is, it depends if you understand what that interpreter is saying or not, right? You may have no idea what the interpreter is saying or not. If you have questions about that, I'm gonna save that one, Jeff, because that is one of our scenarios, and later on we'll talk about how our ethics apply to it, right? Are you being a lawyer in that scenario, or a mediator? Are you enforcing UPL? Or are you enforcing a mediation process? I think your first hat is mediation ethics in that situation, if you're mediating or acting as a neutral, as an arbitrator as well, potentially. But there's also a question of degrees in all of this. There's a saying out there that says the worst enemy of the good is the perfect sometimes. And if I had to stop every single time that I heard some kind of a clarification question being answered, I think a good quarter of my cases would go straight out the window. Just in terms of past life, having dealt with a lot of people who are self-represented, at least in my practice, who have not necessarily even come in with lawyers, who would never think to hire a lawyer, who would never have the confidence to walk through the door of a lawyer's office, who are just going to go on the advice of their friends and their experiences, or maybe hire a notary or a paralegal type document person who is more familiar and less scary to them. So there are real questions of degrees of what's possible out there. And it does lend itself to a lot of exploitation, frankly. But it would be incorrect to kind of cover the sun with a thumb and say it's not there. All of that is happening on a regular daily basis. In at least based on what I've seen, if there is a lawyer, it's that lawyer's job to hire that interpreter, right? So some of the quality of the back and forth is going to fall to the lawyer to be the one who's enforcing, I would say. If it's just the mediator and a self-represented party whose job it would be to bring a person, this is a very practical question, right? Who retains the interpreter, and what kind of interpreter do they bring, right? That's shifts some of the mechanics in these scenarios. I wanted to share this little cartoon. I know it's in Spanish, but this is Mafalda. She's a cartoon character from Argentina, the 1960s and 70s. And she's sort of this little girl who dreams that she wants to make the world a better place. And what she wants to, when she grows up, she wants to be a translator of the UN. And she's sitting here dreaming about how when one person says, one delegate says to that, oh, your country is disgusting, and I'm going to turn around and translate, your country is so charming, and nobody's going to be able to fight, and there's not going to be any arguments or wars, and the world will be safe. And so tell him to go to blankety blankety blank. Now, grown up Mafalda is actually going to ethically have to translate all of those symbols. We mediators are pretty familiar with having been in that scenario. You make sure to tell the other side to blankety blankety blank, because interpreters have very similar ethical responsibilities to us, to what we do. Their standards are accuracy, completeness, and managing conflicts of interest. And so they might get put in a situation like one side they both need an interpreter, only one side brings one, right? Now how do you do it? Can you interpret for both sides? No. Usually, ethically, if you're certified, you're not going to do it, right? So in terms of the ideal, obviously, is to get the person with the best credentials and hopefully somebody certified. But a lot of times we're dealing with make it work kind of solutions. I think it is important to point out that the mediation confidentiality does apply to the interpreters as mediation participants. This is in Florida, and we also have a in-state confidentiality law as well that basically indicates that the interpreter and potentially the translator, right, who's going to be seeing a draft unsigned document maybe, are bound by the party's privilege of mediation confidentiality, which includes mediation communications. And I know confidentiality is handled differently in different states, so I'm going to say that with a grain of salt, but they are sort of under the cone of silence, if you will, when you're going forward on this. So let's shift gears into the mediator ethics part. I love ethics. Ty knows this way. I just got appointed to the ethical committee here in Florida. We have our own in-house rules. It's the Florida Rules of Professional and Court-Appointed Mediators, and it's interpreted by a 9-person committee. If you have sort of a question of, I don't think the answer is clear in the rules, what should I do in this kind of scenario? And so it's just kind of fun to argue about angels on a pinhead and give people hopefully ethical advice or practical advice, not always the same thing, on how to resolve those issues. But what I'm going to use in this presentation is the model standards for conduct for mediators, which are the ABA, AAA, ACR standards. So those are more widely applicable, but to me, they cover those essential principles, right? And so even though the local rules or interpretations might be different, let's sort of go in and look at a couple of scenarios. So let's look at this first one here, right? We have a party who appears and by the way, like at this point, I know I've been talking, but by all means, jump in for this last part. A party appears at mediation with an informal interpreter to help them communicate, but the other side says, I don't want that person in here. I'm not going to say why, but they just don't want the other person to participate. And so my question to you as mediators is, should the mediation go forward with the informal interpreter without the agreement of both parties? Yes or no?
Potentially.
Potentially.
It depends on who that other person is.
It depends.
Yeah. Well, so if that individual is somehow related, is known to them, and so no, they shouldn't. But if they're not, but they're just someone who, for instance, when I was a staff mediator at the courthouse, we would ask, can anyone help us who speaks? If someone said yes and they don't know them, then the answer is yes, it should go forward, in my opinion.
So anybody else gonna argue against Ty on this one? Who says no, just to be contrary? All right, so I hear leaning towards yes on the whole here in the silence. I'll share with you standard 6 on the quality of the process. I think standard 6 actually has a bit of a contradiction, which makes it an it depends. I understand the leaning to yes as a result of this, but section 3, it points to the fact that for an additional participant to be included, it depends on the mediator and the parties, plural, right? If the other person holds their position, even after you try to mediate that participation of an additional person issue, and you go forward with that, they're okay, you are risking your impartiality before you get started, right? On the other hand, you have that section 10 part of the same standard, which is that if a party appears to have difficulty comprehending or participating in a mediation, the mediator has an obligation to explore the circumstances and potential accommodations or adjustments to the process. I mean, you can turn around and be like, this can't go forward unless this person gets it. And that would definitely be a leaning towards yes kind of situation. But I have heard arguments like, no, they're going to be a witness in the case. I don't want them hearing stuff. You know, there might be other considerations that could kick in, and the other side might have a valid argument for why this person shouldn't be listening in or mediating, or I'm sorry, interpreting based on a number of factors. So, but one of my mentors is Greg Firestone, and in case anybody's come across him. And he has a working definition of empowerment, which I like, which is to be able to be heard and to be understood. And so I like that because it's this vision of two-way communication, right? You're hearing what I'm saying, and also I'm understanding what I'm trying to tell you, right? And so this party in our scenario, from my perspective, the one that I gave, right, has brought this informal person, and they're taking on their responsibility to be heard and understood to the best of their ability, potentially. And they are strengthening their own capacity to exercise self-determination by choosing someone who they think is gonna get them heard and understood, or, you know, give them the real deal, perhaps treading on what Jeff was saying about earlier, you know, giving some opinion, right? It's not a perfect solution, but, you know, if that person, we haven't gotten there yet, we're just trying to get them into the room. And so it seems sort of defensible to step in and support the inclusion of that informal interpreter under the idea of accommodation, but it still does create potential issues. Okay, how about this one? The mediator is communicating, this is Jeff's scenario, with a party through an interpreter. The interpreter and the party are engaged in a back and forth conversation, and it appears that more may be going on than simple interpretation. The language gap between the mediator and the party and their interpreter means that the mediator is not sure, can't be for sure, but you're reading body language and tone, all those things. So the mediator stops and clarifies the interpreter's role. You say to me what the person is saying, and then you say to the person what I'm saying, but the back and forth behavior continues. We have this language gap between the mediator and the party, right? Should the mediator keep mediating? Yes or no? It doesn't get into UPL, but it gets just to the basics of mediation. Should that mediator continue? Anybody for yes?
You know, I'm going to say trust your instincts, and the mediator's instincts are usually on point. I want to say no, but there could be an instance when it's helping. It's case by case.
Right. So let's look at some of the standards then. Standard 6A, right? Again, we sort of have this contradiction here, you know, in terms of, you know, we see that this sort of that presence of the appropriate participants, right? This participant came in with the role of an interpreter, and so questions and clarifications might be a normal thing. Like, can you say that in a different way? I didn't quite understand what you meant, especially if it's sort of an informal translation going on and the person is not super skilled. But when it appears that you're starting to sort of slide over into opinions and advice, this might get more challenging for the mediator, and the responsibilities that are coming up, I think, because in C, you have to stop mediation or end mediation if you think that the conduct of the participants is jeopardizing the process. It's hard because this mediator can't tell, doesn't understand the language to be able to completely decipher what's being discussed. And leaning on the interpreter to get what the party is saying is probably your best option for clarifying this issue. You know, the dark side of self-determination is sometimes people have very hard time making decisions by themselves, and they just sort of need to talk it out in order to hear it in their own voice. Or they really like to have input from other people, and they don't, you know, they may or not may not have the kind of input that they need, but this is what they managed to bring. So it does depend, but that, you know, that there's definitely a line there where you might have to stop if things are really getting out of hand. How about this situation? In a caucus, Okay, we're in caucus. The mediator and the party have a common language, but the lawyer does not. The lawyer indicates that the mediator should communicate in Spanish with the party and in English with the lawyer, and the client agrees. The mediator explains that it can be ethically perilous, if not forbidden. In Florida, it would be a no-no, for a mediator to step in as the interpreter. The lawyer and the party insist that they want the mediator to be their go-between. So in Spanish, the lawyer has the language gap, and in English, the party has the language gap, but the mediator understands both of them. Should mediation proceed without an interpreter, or do you require an interpreter before proceeding? What do people think? Has anyone been in this situation before? Yes. All right, let's look at the standards. Y'all are a quiet bunch today. So we're back at standard 6 again in terms of quality of the process. All these things kind of tie back to it, right? In section A, you start seeing that how the role of the mediator differs, right? We've talked about how interpretation and translation are separate professions, that they have their own standards, their own certifications. Just like mediation, it's hard to do any of those things well because you got to keep lots of things going on, and mixing the roles can be problematic. I do notice it doesn't say forbidden, but it also doesn't say encouraged. What a mediator is allowed to do is this little line here that covers a multitude of sins. Provide information the mediator is qualified by training or experience to provide consistent with the standard. And there's obviously a tension there. If you have language experience, you can provide some information, but can you serve as a full interpreter? It's a question of degree. Potentially, remember our conversation about proficiency? Like if that lawyer is like, I can't really speak in Spanish, but I understand a whole lot of it, and my client is much more comfortable speaking in Spanish, they can communicate more quickly and efficiency, but most of what you say in English, they're going to get, you could probably go forward in that kind of a scenario. But if this is a person who has no idea what the client is saying, then you probably can't. I think it's also important to look at the conflict of interest standards as well. When you look at the first part, you can see how easy, how interpreting or translating can create an appearance or an actual conflict of interest during and after mediation, right? During with interpreting and after, if you're going to go somehow write the agreement into something else. And so, especially if you're just giving that assistance to one side, and we're talking about a private caucus in this scenario. But if you look at section D, there are some conflicts that are waivable with the disclosure and the disclosure to an approval of both parties. There's all kinds of conflicts that are waivable. And so is this one of those? Question mark, right? But there is the risk of some conflicts that can undermine the integrity of the mediation. The ones that create the obligation for you to withdraw completely. And that often that survives even after the mediation is done. For example, offering to translate an agreement could be problematic potentially. So this is this one and one more. I have 5 scenarios for you. So this is number 4. A mediation between 2 self-represented parties. Everyone in the mediation speaks Spanish, including the mediator. Only one of the 2 parties speaks English. The mediator was selected by the parties based on language ability, conducts the mediation in Spanish. The parties reach an agreement. The parties have asked for an efficient and a low-cost process. So the mediator writes the agreement in English and reads it back to the parties in Spanish. Both parties signed the English agreement. There was no time-consuming or costly interpreter or translator costs. The mediation is done quickly, efficiently, and to the parties' satisfaction. We have sort of a language gap as to one language gap as to English between the parties, and that's sort of between the party and the court system, if you will. But everybody in the agreement itself in English. So, did this mediator behave correctly? Yes or no? I just realized I'm seeing some chats, but let me see here. Who thinks that the mediator did it okay. Why not write it in Spanish? Good question. Good question. Good question.
Christina, is not the broader question, doesn't it really go back to the question of what is law practice? And in California, and I think every place, drafting a contract that affects the legal rights of other people is law practice. So here you have one person, the mediator, drafting the contract and doing it not as lawyer for one party, but perhaps for both parties, and crossing the line from mediator to lawyer, doing so with a clear conflict of interest because you're doing it purportedly on behalf of both parties, and not disclosing to the parties that you've shifted from mediator to lawyer, and not seeking the appropriate waivers of conflict of interest that a lawyer would routinely get when representing more than one party. And here a query whether that conflict is waivable at all.
That's a very, very good question. I can tell you that until an ethical opinion came down from the Mediator committee here in Florida, courthouse mediators did this all the time. For example, mediating county cases for small stipulations or family cases where you're drafting parenting plans for people and things of that sort. I mean, I've probably done hundreds of them in the scenarios. I don't do it anymore after the decision came in. Frankly, it never occurred to me that I was potentially translating anything back and forth when I would sort of write it in English and read it back, because in my head, the two things exist simultaneously, language-wise.
And what did the Florida opinion hold?
The Florida opinion held that reading an agreement back is an act of translation, and so that ended this particular practice of sort of read it back to the parties in Spanish.
Reading it in a different language than the language in which it is written.
Yes. Yes.
And mediators are no longer allowed to do that in Florida?
That's correct.
So
That is correct.
So could a mediator, let's just say everybody speaks the same language, could a mediator say to unrepresented parties, look, here's this release, this is what it means. It means blah, 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 blah. And you're releasing potentially unknown claims, and that potentially releasing unknown claims. And it means
at that point, I'm translating a release. Because
well,
if
yes,
I have a release written in English for a person who doesn't understand it.
Can a mediator, let's say an insurance company comes up with a release, and a plaintiff who may be less sophisticated than the insurance company is in a situation of asking a mediator, well, what the heck does this mean? Can you explain that, assuming whether you're a lawyer or not, can you explain that without running afoul of the boundary between practice of mediation and practice of law?
I think that is probably a different question of degree, because that's not a document that the mediator themselves helped create in terms of memorializing the agreement. We don't have an obligation to draft, but sometimes we do. And in this scenario, this is what the mediator was doing. But in a situation where the other party, where one of the parties has created a document and is providing it to the other one, I think that's a great scenario. I don't think that a mediator would be served by getting into the middle of that one. And so there are never enough court-certified interpreters here in the Superior Court, so couldn't the mediator issue a disclaimer? I'm going to skip to the next one because I think it's sort of, this is also based on a recent Florida opinion, and I think it's kind of been the one that sort of helps us with both of them. I mean, I think there's sort of that competence factor. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should, ethically speaking, right? It's sort of, it can lead you into the realm of no good deed goes unpunished if you happen to be too helpful, and land yourself in a more ambiguous kind of situation. If you're looking, if you have that training and the experience and the consent of the parties, you have potentially a conflict between self-determination, right? Here's what they're asking you to do, right? And the line in self-determination that says, well, you don't have to do and you shouldn't do everything that they ask you to do, right? You are allowed to say my ethics forbid me to do that in order to stay out of a difficult kind of a situation. I think it's important to kind of not lose track of the first part though, because if people are looking for a self-contained part of the process, you know, they're trying to be done that day. Think of how satisfying it is to your English clients in an English system to be able to sign on the day of, right? And how challenging it can be when that's kind of taken away from you. I don't want to take away that impact. I don't want to take away that impact, because self-determination to me is the North Star of mediation, right? But so on the one hand, get us quickly through, you know, within our resources, and on the other hand, you're violating all kinds of standards, having to translate the agreement and, you know, sending, you know, doing it yourself instead, and writing the language in something other than the mediations, than the language in which the mediation was conducted. So I'm putting it there because it's perhaps not as ethically ambiguous from a mediation ethics perspective, but it is very practically ambiguous in terms of the realities of what the market would hope for and would look for in terms of the services that are available.
Christina, if I may,
Oh, sure.
I want to also say mediation is an art form. It's not a science. It's not like litigation, and it's case by case. And so the mediator has to ask themselves, can I do this? Should I do this? Will I do this? And you have to read the temperature in the room all the time. And so, for instance, Jeff, you know, I love the question you're bringing up about writing agreements, for instance, and are we acting like attorneys? And then I love someone's comment who just said, what a great yet terrifying session. And because there's no black and white in mediation, right? There's a lot of gray though. And so sometimes we have to, I can't do that. And sometimes we have to say, you know what? Yes, I can, because the situation says it's okay. And it's case by case, you know. I'm sorry, I don't want to take over.
No, not at all. I think what, and it is like, I don't disagree. And I would add, it's also a question of degree and looking for other solutions that keep your hands clean, right? This last scenario, and I know we're nearing time here, so is we have a bilingual mediator. In one caucus, the mediator speaks Spanish with the lawyer and the client, and in the other caucus, the mediator speaks English with the lawyer and the client. And the mediator then assists with writing the agreement in English. And advises the party who only speaks Spanish to obtain a translation of the agreement before signing it. And either their lawyer reads it to them right there, or they go and they get a separate translation. But the mediator adjourns, right, does a continuance of the mediation to allow the opportunity for that party to get the translation. And there's sort of a language gap between the caucus rooms and from Spanish to the court system, but inside each room, there's no language gap, right? So did that mediator behave correctly?
Yes.
In Florida, at least, this is a very recent MEAC opinion that kind of clarified all of it and brought it all up to date, and kind of took us out of the scenario of, no, you can't do any of this. And as a multilingual mediator, you really felt like after that sort of early chain of opinions, like, I lost a lot of my powers. And so this, I feel like this one in particular kind of restores what you can do for people in a way that also keeps you on the ethical straight and narrow.
I'm sorry, Christina. So it's okay to adjourn. It's okay to adjourn a mediation, tell people to go get further information about the translation.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yes. Although interestingly, it doesn't touch on confidentiality. So whoever reads that agreement probably should be read in to an opening statement, but that's not usually going to happen. I have also had people be like, in my common language scenario, I will just tell them, you can't sign it in front of here. And a lot of times they'll just go out in the hallway, sign it, and just turn it back in. They're just going to trust what I wrote and sort of go from there. Because they just want to be done. And it's, you know, they're not thinking, you know, anything other than finality. So we have impartiality, right? Second only to self-determination, free from favoritism. We might not be the best judges of our abilities, right? Sometimes, and so you're trying to keep that bias from seeping in. You don't have to rescue the underdog every time. You also don't have to, you can't sort of perpetrate the system by not providing any help at all. I think these are our ethical filters for the language side of things. And you know, just competence, making sure that your skills are up to standard, the quality of the process factors that we talked about more towards the beginning. The whole idea of conflict of interest, you know, what is waivable, what is not, and even if they want to waive it, are you going to do it anyways? Should you do it? Will you do it? And sort of being able to give them input on the shape of the process and the shape of the outcome, and saying no to the requests that you can't ethically honor, and balancing between the two sides. And everybody has their lane in this particular case, right? You have the parties and the lawyers who get to choose a mediator, bring an interpreter, pick a language for the session in the caucus, pick the language things are going to be written in, and get a translation if necessary, right? And as a mediator, I think you're trying to accommodate people. You got to clarify and uphold whatever your ethical limits are, depending on where you are. And you're working with the parties on those process decisions, giving them whatever information you can without going too far astray, and creating opportunities at the end of the just like you create the accommodations at the beginning, you have to do some more accommodating at the end to kind of land the plane safely, right, if you will. I did promise solutions. I know the slides are up, okay? I think we've largely covered them. I will stop on this one. These are two examples of some like end of signature block kind of clauses that I've come up with. The top one is from the Palm Beach County Court Circuit, and the last one is from a mediator named Karen Putney Evans. I don't think they'll save you from, you know, malpractice, but it's kind of good to have it in your forms potentially as a way to kind of trigger that discussion sometimes. And so I think you're always trying to balance your the language of your brain and the language of your heart, if you will. And you know, people are often scared, confused, overwhelmed. So you're trying to be able to get them to communicate and be effective. So thank you so much for the opportunity today. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And
great presentation, Christina.
Contact info, and I'm going to put that up there because I did promise the the website at the end.
The Soup Kitchen, as you said before we started, what an amazing name. They got in early, right?
Yes, yes, that's an early, that's how that they got into the internet in the early day and got a really good domain, right?
Right, right. Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you all. And thank you for any donations that you might be able to make to the Soup Kitchen or any other food bank. And please let us know so we can add your donation to the running total. And we'll see you next week for another fantastic Will Work for Food, the New Possibilities Hour. Okay, thanks again, Christina. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great day.